The Germans had a word for it, Instandsetzung, the art of battlefield repair, and they believed, with considerable justification, that no army on earth did it better than the Wehrmacht. They had refined mobile maintenance into something approaching a science, deploying specialized recovery teams, trained engineers, and tiered repair echelons that could strip and rebuild a Panzer IV in the field with almost surgical precision. They had done it in the frozen mud of the Eastern Front, in the burning sands of North Africa, and across the hedgerow country of France. So when German technical officers began filing post-war intelligence assessments and testimonies about what they had witnessed on the Western Front between 1944 and 1945, the candor of what they wrote is remarkable, because man after man, unit after unit, described the same phenomenon with the same stunned disbelief. American armored units that had been visibly battered in the afternoon, vehicles burning and broken across the landscape, would somehow reappear the following morning, repaired, refueled, rearmed, and rolling forward again. One German panzer officer, captured near the Siegfried Line, reportedly told his American interrogators that he had stopped believing his own forward observers when they reported enemy tank losses, because by the next engagement, those same tanks seemed to materialize back out of thin air. What the Germans had encountered was not magic, and it was not an accident. It was the result of a deliberate, ambitious, and largely forgotten American military revolution, the Ordnance Maintenance Battalion system, and understanding it requires going back to the years before the first American soldier ever set foot on a European beach, to a moment when the United States Army looked at its own industrial capacity and made a decision that would quietly reshape the nature of modern armored warfare. In the late 1930s, American military planners grappling with the lessons of the Spanish Civil War, the fall of France, and the opening campaigns of the North African desert recognized something that most European armies had not yet fully internalized, that a tank destroyed through mechanical failure or moderate combat damage was not simply a vehicle lost, it was a catastrophic economic and logistical event. Building a medium tank in 1942 required thousands of man-hours, specialized steel alloys, precision machine components, and an industrial supply chain that stretched across an entire continent. Shipping that tank across 3,000 miles of submarine-threatened Atlantic Ocean required fuel, convoy escorts, dock space, and transport tonnage that was always in desperately short supply. And then, after all of that, to have that vehicle knocked out by a 75mm round that punched through a track assembly, or by an engine that seized after swallowing road grit, and simply leave it on the battlefield, that was a waste the United States Army decided it could not afford. The solution they developed was breathtaking in its ambition. Rather than treating vehicle recovery and repair as a secondary function handled informally by crews and unit mechanics, the Army formalized it into a dedicated military discipline with its own doctrine, its own chain of command, its own specialized vehicles, and its own highly trained soldiers. The Ordnance Department, working in conjunction with the Armored Force Headquarters at Fort Knox, developed a maintenance structure built around 3 distinct echelons of repair, each one capable of handling progressively more serious damage, each one designed to function under fire, in mud, in darkness, in the rain, with nothing but what could be carried on tracks and wheels. The first echelon was the tank crew itself, trained not merely to operate their vehicle, but to perform immediate battlefield maintenance, track adjustments, filter cleaning, minor oil changes, basic electrical troubleshooting. The second echelon was the company or battalion maintenance section, equipped with half-track-mounted toolkits, spare parts, and mechanics who could handle moderate repairs within hours. But it was the third echelon, the Ordnance Maintenance Battalion, that made the Germans reach for their pens in disbelief after the war, because these were not rear-area workshops hidden safely behind the lines. These were mobile, mechanized repair factories that followed armored divisions across Europe at distances sometimes measured in single-digit miles from the front. An American armored division in 1944 possessed an organic maintenance structure of extraordinary depth. Attached to each division was an Ordnance Maintenance Battalion, typically composed of several hundred specialized soldiers, divided into companies with distinct functions: a light maintenance company for wheeled vehicles, a heavy maintenance company for tanks and tank destroyers, an automotive company, and a service company managing the spare parts supply chain. These men arrived in Normandy with M32 tank recovery vehicles, modified M4 Sherman hulls fitted with a powerful winch, a crane jib, and a direct support toolset, and with the M31 tank recovery vehicle based on the M3 Grant chassis, capable of towing battle-damaged tanks across terrain that would stop a conventional wheeled vehicle entirely. They also brought with them something rarer and more valuable than any piece of equipment: a maintenance culture that had been drilled into them at ordnance training centers in Aberdeen, Maryland, and at the specialized automotive schools that the Army had stood up across the United States in the early war years, training soldiers who in civilian life had been garage mechanics from rural Kansas, assembly line workers from Detroit, machinists from Pittsburgh, and farm equipment repairmen from the Iowa flatlands, men who understood machinery not as abstract systems but as physical objects that could be coaxed, improvised upon, and fixed with whatever was at hand. The contrast with German practice was subtle but profound. The Wehrmacht's maintenance system was in many respects technically superior at the unit level. German mechanics were extraordinarily skilled, and the tiered repair system that Germany employed was sophisticated and well considered. But German maintenance culture had been built around vehicles of increasing complexity and decreasing standardization. By 1944, the proliferation of German tank variants, Panthers, Tigers, Tiger IIs, Panzer IVs, Stu GIIs, Jagged Panzer IVs, Jagdpanthers, had created a parts nightmare of historic proportions. A German maintenance unit servicing a mixed panzer regiment might need to carry parts compatible with 5 or 6 fundamentally different powertrains, transmission systems, and suspension configurations, because the vehicles shared almost nothing with each other at the component level. The American approach was almost philosophically opposite. The M4 Sherman, which equipped the great majority of American armored units throughout the European campaign, was a vehicle of deliberate, aggressive standardization. It was not the most powerful tank in the war. The Germans knew it, and the Sherman crews knew it painfully well, but it was designed from the beginning to be maintained. Its Ford GAA V8 engine, used in the majority of production variants, was an engine that American mechanics already understood, because Ford had been building derivatives of it for civilian use before the war. Its transmission was a synchromesh unit that a trained mechanic could remove and replace in the field without specialized lifting equipment beyond what the M32 recovery vehicle carried as standard. Its track system, using rubber-bushed steel links on the later production models, was designed to be repaired or replaced by a 2-man crew with basic tools in under 2 hours. And crucially, because thousands of Shermans had been built to essentially identical specifications, spare parts were interchangeable across virtually the entire fleet. A transmission pulled from a knocked-out tank outside Mortain could be fitted without modification into a tank that had thrown its gearbox on the road to Falaise. The Germans, watching American armored columns through artillery observation posts and forward scout teams, noticed something that defied their tactical understanding. After engagements in which German anti-tank guns or panzers had clearly scored multiple hits on American armor, hits they could verify by the smoke, the stopped vehicles, the crews bailing out, the Americans would not simply abandon their vehicles and replace them from reserve pools. Instead, within hours, sometimes while the engagement was still ongoing on adjacent ridgelines, strange squat vehicles with cranes would appear and begin dragging the damaged tanks rearward. The Germans had seen tank recovery before. Obviously, every army did it, but the speed and scale of what the Americans were doing was different in kind, not just degree. An account from a German panzer officer who had served with the 2nd SS Panzer Division des Reich, captured in the aftermath of the Falaise pocket and later interviewed by Allied intelligence, described watching through binoculars as American recovery vehicles worked through the night following a day of heavy fighting near St. Lo in the summer of 1944. He noted that where he had expected to see a field of abandoned hulks in the morning, the normal outcome of such an engagement by any army's standard, he instead observed most of the previously damaged vehicles moving again under their own power. His intelligence estimate of American armored strength in that sector had to be completely revised, because the loss figures he had reported to divisional headquarters the previous evening were, by dawn, essentially meaningless. This was precisely the outcome American planners had designed the system to produce, and the operational philosophy behind it had been articulated clearly in the Army's own field manuals well before the first engagement in Tunisia. The doctrine held that a tank which could be repaired and returned to action in 24 to 48 hours represented a far more efficient use of resources than shipping a replacement from the United States, and moreover, that a damaged tank returned to its original crew maintained unit cohesion and tactical effectiveness in ways that a brand new vehicle crewed by strangers could not replicate. So the Ordnance Battalions were given an explicit operational mandate: recover everything that can move and fix everything that has moved to a recovery point. The practical result was that American armored units maintained what military historians would later term remarkably high operational readiness rates even during sustained offensive operations. Detailed records from the 2nd Armored Division, which fought from Normandy through Belgium, across the German border, and eventually to the Elbe River, show that despite constant combat and relentless mechanical attrition, the division maintained between 60 and 75% operational readiness for its tank fleet during most of the European campaign, figures that German panzer divisions fighting the same battles could rarely approach, particularly after 1943. When fuel shortages, parts scarcity, and Allied air power began systematically destroying the German maintenance infrastructure before it could function, the men who made this system work were, in most cases, not glamorous figures of the kind that populated post-war memoirs and regimental histories. They were sergeants and corporals and privates, first class, with oil under their fingernails and grease in the creases of their hands, working in the dark with flashlights taped to their helmets, because floodlights in a forward maintenance area would draw German artillery fire within minutes. They worked in temperatures that dropped well below freezing during the Ardennes campaign of December 1944 and January 1945, when frozen lubricants and thermal-shocked metal added mechanical catastrophe to the combat damage already filling their recovery queues. A soldier from the 3rd Armored Division's Ordnance Battalion, interviewed decades after the war for a Veterans History Project recording, described working through a night in Belgium in January 1945, when the temperature had fallen to well below 0 Fahrenheit, trying to replace a damaged final drive assembly on an M4 while wearing gloves so thick he could barely feel the wrench. With the sound of German artillery falling close enough that the concussion periodically knocked tools off the vehicle's hull, he and his team finished the repair before dawn. The tank was back in action by mid-morning. Stories like that one were not exceptional within the Ordnance Battalions. They were representative of a culture that had been deliberately cultivated by officers who understood that the strategic mathematics of armored warfare were ultimately about readiness rates and return-to-action timelines more than they were about raw vehicle counts. The supply chain supporting this repair culture was itself an achievement that deserves its own examination, because a maintenance battalion that runs out of spare parts is simply a collection of men and tools standing helplessly beside broken vehicles. The American logistics system, built around the Red Ball Express highway network that became operational in August 1944, and the vast supply depots at Cherbourg and later Antwerp, maintained a flow of spare parts to forward ordnance units that German logistics planners, reading captured American supply documents after the war, described as almost incomprehensible in its scale. A single American armored division in sustained combat operations might require hundreds of replacement track links per week, dozens of road wheel assemblies, multiple complete engine units, transmission assemblies, gun tubes for damaged main armament, and thousands of smaller components ranging from fuel injectors to periscopes to radio sets. The system that delivered those parts, from the factories in Detroit and Cleveland and Pittsburgh, across the Atlantic, through the supply depots and forward to the maintenance companies, had been designed by men who had studied both the British logistical experience in the Western Desert and the catastrophic German supply failures before Moscow in 1941, and who had concluded that the greatest single cause of armored division combat power loss was not enemy fire, but mechanical attrition combined with parts unavailability. They built the supply chain to defeat that problem first, understanding that enemy action was something a tank crew could fight back against, but a vehicle sitting immobilized for lack of a $40 spare part was a defeat that no amount of courage could remedy. The Sherman's mechanical accessibility, a feature often overlooked in technical comparisons that focus exclusively on armor thickness and gun caliber, played a critical role in making the entire system function at the speed it achieved. Unlike the Panther, whose complex Maybach HL-230 engine required specialized tools and considerable disassembly of surrounding components to access for major repairs, or the Tiger, whose transmission was so heavy and so inaccessibly mounted that field replacement was a multi-day operation requiring purpose-built lifting equipment. The Sherman's powerplant could in many cases be removed and replaced as a complete assembly in 4 to 6 hours by a trained crew with an M32 recovery vehicle's crane. Engine swaps that would have required a German tank to be evacuated to a divisional workshop were being performed by American second-echelon mechanics within earshot of the front lines. A German Panther that suffered engine failure in a forward position was, in the tactical situation of 1944, very likely lost, either through the difficulty of recovery or through the time required for major repairs during which Allied air power or artillery might find it. An American Sherman with a comparable failure had a substantially better chance of being back in action before the next morning's operations began. Post-war testimonies from German officers who had commanded panzer units against American forces in France, Belgium, and Germany consistently returned to this theme with a mixture of professional admiration and tactical frustration. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the Panzer-Lehr Division during the brutal fighting in Normandy and remained one of the most analytically sharp German armor commanders of the war, noted in his post-war assessments that American armored resilience, specifically the ability to absorb losses and regenerate combat power within hours, fundamentally disrupted German tactical planning in a way that raw German tank quality could not overcome. A German counterattack planned for a sector where American armor had been badly mauled the previous day might find, on execution, that the expected weakness had already been repaired and reinforced. Bayerlein and officers like him had been trained in a military tradition that assumed knocked-out vehicles stayed knocked out until the battle had moved on. The American maintenance system violated that assumption systematically and repeatedly. There was also a human dimension to this story that the statistics and technical analyses tend to obscure, which is the relationship between American tank crews and their vehicles, a relationship shaped in part by the maintenance culture the Army had created. Crews who knew that a damaged tank would likely be recovered and repaired, rather than simply abandoned and replaced with an unknown vehicle, developed a different kind of attachment to their machines. The mechanical familiarity that came from actually performing first and second echelon maintenance alongside the battalion mechanics, learning the individual quirks of a specific vehicle's engine, the way a particular transmission shifted, the tension a specific set of tracks needed, created crews who were better able to identify emerging problems before they became catastrophic failures. A crew that noticed an unusual vibration in their final drive and reported it correctly could have that failure diagnosed and repaired during a maintenance halt, rather than discovering it at the worst possible moment during a combat engagement. The ordnance officers who managed this culture understood something about human psychology that the Army had learned from its industrial mobilization experience, that soldiers who are trained to maintain and care for complex equipment develop a sense of ownership and responsibility that translates directly into better operational outcomes. The contrast between this approach and the German experience by late 1944 was starker still when accounting for the degradation of the German maintenance system under Allied air attack. The Luftwaffe's inability to protect German rear areas meant that the workshops, parts depots, and fuel storage facilities that German maintenance units depended upon were being systematically destroyed by American and British air power throughout the campaign. A German Panther needing third echelon repairs in October 1944 might wait weeks for a workshop that was either bombed, overloaded with other casualties, or simply unable to obtain parts that no longer existed in the supply chain. The cumulative effect was that German panzer divisions entering the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, Operation Watch on the Rhine, the last great German armored gamble in the West, were doing so with maintenance backlogs that had never been cleared, vehicles that were mechanically marginal, and a parts supply situation that German logistical officers privately described in their diaries as catastrophic. American ordnance units supporting the divisions that bore the brunt of the Ardennes attack, the 7th Armored Division at St. Vith, the 4th Armored Division during Patton's famous relief drive to Bastogne, performed maintenance under conditions of extraordinary difficulty and danger. The 4th Armored Division's organic maintenance units followed the division's lightning northward advance in late December and early January, with recovery and repair operations that were, in some instances, conducted within direct small arms range of German positions. The division's ability to sustain its armored strength through that drive, reaching Bastogne on the evening of December 26, 1944, was not solely a product of crew courage and officer leadership, though both were present in abundance. It was also a product of the maintenance battalions keeping enough tanks moving to maintain the operational tempo that made the relief possible. In the Pacific Theater, the maintenance challenge wore a different face, but demanded the same ingenuity. Island campaigns presented ordnance units with terrain that made European road networks look hospitable by comparison. On Leyte, on Luzon, in the jungles and volcanic soil of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, armored units operated in conditions where conventional recovery vehicles could not reach damaged tanks without risk of becoming casualties themselves, where tropical humidity and coral dust created mechanical failure modes that no training exercise in the continental United States had fully prepared crews for, and where the distances from base workshops to forward positions could stretch recovery timelines from hours to days. American ordnance units adapted, improvising recovery techniques using local materials, developing field-expedient repair methods for damage types not covered in their technical manuals, and in several documented cases, fabricating replacement parts from raw stock when the supply chain could not deliver in time. The adaptability was not accidental. It was the product of a training system that had emphasized problem-solving and mechanical reasoning rather than simple procedural compliance. The legacy of what American mobile maintenance battalions achieved in World War II is difficult to quantify precisely because the system's greatest victories were negative events, tanks that were not lost, engagements that did not fail for lack of armored strength, offensives that did not stall because a division's tank strength had fallen below operational viability. Military historians examining American armored operations in Europe have repeatedly noted that American divisions sustained operational tempos that would have been logistically impossible without the maintenance return rates the ordnance battalions produced. George Patton's Third Army, which covered more ground in less time than virtually any armored force in the history of warfare to that point, did so in part because its maintenance units were able to keep a sufficiently high percentage of its tank fleet operational during a pace of advance that broke down vehicles through sheer mechanical exhaustion at rates that would have paralyzed a less well-supported force. The Germans who wrote about this after the war were not naive observers making excuses for their own failures. They were, in most cases, technically sophisticated officers who understood armored warfare at its highest level and who recognized, with the clarity that defeat sometimes provides, that they had been outclassed not merely in production numbers or strategic resources, but in a specific operational discipline that they had underestimated. The American ability to fix their tanks overnight was not a novelty or a fortunate accident. It was a system built on doctrine, sustained by logistics, and executed by men with wrenches in their hands in the dark and the cold and the rain. It was one of the least celebrated and most consequential American military innovations of the Second World War, and when the last armored campaigns of the Western Front were finally analyzed in the cold light of post-war assessment, the Ordnance Maintenance Battalions stood revealed as something the history books rarely remember to honor, a combat multiplier so effective that the enemy noticed it before the victors did.